For a price of just $35, a solitary man named James purchased a ranch. Yet, the first sight to greet him were 3 indigenous women hanging from ropes just outside the gate. What kind of man rides into the desert expecting peace, only to be met by death swaying in the wind? James had asked himself that question even before he reached the gate of his new property, a battered piece of land he bought for the promise of solitude. The Arizona sky stretched wide above him, the late autumn air thin and sharp, carrying the taste of dust and distance. He'd been riding 4 hours, the sun sliding lower, and the light turning the sand to molten gold, when he saw them, 3 figures suspended from a weathered wooden beam, just beyond the warped fence line. For a moment, he thought they were effigies, a warning to trespassers. But the way the wind moved their hair and the creak of the rope told a different truth. They were alive, but barely. His heart shied, sensing the scent of death in the air, and James swung down, his boots hitting the dry earth. As he got closer, the wind felt colder against his neck. Their faces were dark with bruises, skin ashen, and eyes closed. The first rope he cut was rough and stiff, biting into his palm, as the body of the first young woman sagged into his arms. Her weight was light to light, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. He eased her down, laid her on the dirt, and moved to the second, then the third, working fast, every second measured against the weakening flutter of their breath. His knife was sharp, but his hands shook not from fear, but from the slow, cold anger building in his chest. Whoever had done this hadn't just meant to kill, they had meant to send a message. And now the message had reached the wrong man. When all 3 were on the ground, he checked their pulses, pressing 2 fingers against each slender neck, feeling faint but steady beats. They were alive, somehow. He didn't waste time. The sun was dropping, and with it, the desert temperature would plummet. He carried them one by one through the creaking gate, across the brittle yard where weeds had long since choked the earth, and into the shadowed interior of the house. Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and long abandonment. He found a blanket, tore it into strips to rub at their cold limbs, and lit the stove with shaking matches until the fire caught and the iron belly began to glow. He heated water, poured it into tin cups, and dribbled it carefully past their cracked lips. The first to open her eyes was the tallest, with dark, matted hair, her jaw clenched as if she had been holding her breath for days. She looked at him not with gratitude, but with suspicion, a fierce spark under the exhaustion. The second stirred soon after, slimmer, her gaze softer but no less wary. The youngest, hardly more than a girl, flinched at the sound of his voice and tried to curl into herself. He didn't press them with questions. They were breathing, that was enough for now. Outside, the sky dimmed to violet, and the wind whispered along the fence like dry bones. James sat at the table, staring at the 3 of them huddled near the stove, and knew that whatever this place had been in the past, it was already dragging him into something deeper than he'd bargained for. He'd bought a ranch, but what he'd truly stepped into was someone else's war. He thought about the $35 he'd handed over in town, the way the seller, an old man with eyes too quick to look away, hadn't asked a single question about why James wanted it. Now he understood. This land carried trouble in its soil. He tried to piece together the details. Indigenous women, bound and left to die in plain sight, meant the attackers wanted them found. They wanted someone to know the cost of crossing them. He poured himself a measure of whiskey from the bottle he'd packed in his saddlebag, the burn steadying his thoughts. He had no kin here, no allies, no stake in the women's affairs, at least not until today. But leaving them to die would have been a sin too heavy to carry. He looked at their faces again in the wavering firelight, the tall one with a proud set to her jaw even in exhaustion, the middle one's steady gaze that seemed to measure the room in silence, the youngest trembling hands wrapped tight in the blanket. They were survivors, but barely, and the ones who had strung them up would likely come back to finish the job. James took another drink and made himself a quiet promise. He would not let them be taken again, not while they were under his roof. Outside, the desert night settled like a shroud, the stars sharp as glass. Somewhere in the distance, A coyote called, the sound carrying across the open land like a warning. James banked the fire, checked the rifle leaning by the door, and sat back down, his eyes never leaving the three strangers whose fate had just tangled itself with his own. He'd come here for peace, but the West had a way of twisting a man's intentions. Tonight, under the weight of the cold wind and the memory of those swinging bodies, James knew the quiet life was already gone. Part by morning, the desert light crept through the warped shutters, painting thin bars across the dusty floorboards. James had slept in the chair, boots still on, rifle leaning within reach. The three women were still huddled by the stove, wrapped in blankets, their breathing steady but guarded. He brewed coffee, the bitter scent curling through the air, and set out what little food he had: dried beans, a few strips of salted pork, and hard biscuits that could chip a tooth. Hunger outweighed mistrust. They ate in silence, each mouthful measured, their eyes flicking toward him and then away. It was the tallest, the one with the sharp, unflinching gaze, who finally spoke. Her voice was low and hoarse, but carried an edge of command. "Lyra," she said, "these are my sisters, Lena and Tara." James nodded, saying nothing, letting her decide how much to give. She didn't waste words. "This land," she said. "It was ours before the Galloways took it." The name landed heavy in the room, a name he recognized. The Galloways were money and guns, and the kind of power that could bend the law to its will. Lyra's jaw tightened. "Our people lived here for generations. The soil was dry, but we found water deep under the ground, hidden from the sun enough to keep our families alive when others went thirsty. My father and the elders kept its place secret, even from some of our own. But secrets don't stay buried." Lena, who had been quiet, lifted her eyes to James. Her tone was measured and deliberate, as if she weighed each syllable. "Someone talked, or someone listened too closely. Galloway men came in the night. They shot the elders, poisoned the well, and burned the storage huts. Those who ran into the desert, most didn't come back." Tara's voice broke in, light and trembling. "They killed Mama." Her words snagged on the memory, and she pressed the blanket tighter around herself. Lyra put a steadying hand on her sister's arm, but didn't stop the telling. "We survived because we were taken away before the attack. Our uncle was trying to keep us safe, but Galloway's men found us anyway. For years, they've hunted us. We carry what's left of our people, the memory of where the water runs, and a map drawn by our father before he died. That map is the only proof it exists." James's coffee had gone cold in his hands. The story fit with whispers he'd heard in border towns, tales of ranchers fighting over water, like wolves over meat. In this country, water was gold, and men would kill for less. "You're saying they hung you up out there as a warning?" he said slowly. Lyra's eyes met his, hard and unblinking. "As bait. They knew someone would come. Maybe someone who'd sell us. Or maybe just to watch us die." James thought about the seller in town. The way the man had avoided his eyes. Had he known what would be waiting? Probably. The land had been too cheap, the deal too easy. "Where's the map now?" James asked. The question made all three women tense. Lena answered, her voice like flint striking stone. "Hidden. No one knows where. Not even us. Not exactly. Our father split it into 3 pieces, each with part of the truth. Only together can it be read." That was clever. It also meant the Galloways couldn't kill just one of them. They needed all 3 alive until they had the whole picture. James set the cup down, leaning forward. "If the Galloways want that map, they'll be back. They won't care who's standing in the way." Lyra's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "We know." There was no fear in her tone, only a weary certainty. He studied them. Lyra's steady defiance, Lena's watchful calm, Tara's fragile stillness, and knew they'd been living on borrowed time for years. "So what do you want from me?" he asked. Tara's voice was small. "We didn't ask you to save us, but you did. That makes you part of it now." The truth of it settled like dust in his lungs. He had no claim to their fight, no reason to stay except the one he felt in his gut. Leaving them now would be the same as stringing them back up on that beam. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the dry rasp of sand against wood. James's gaze shifted toward the window, scanning the horizon as if expecting riders already. "All right," he said finally. "You can stay, but if we're going to make it through this, I need to know exactly what I'm up against." Lyra exchanged a glance with her sisters, then began to tell him more. The names of the men who'd led the slaughter, the places they'd hidden from the hunters, the signs they'd learned to watch for. The Galloways, she said, had men everywhere, ranch hands, lawmen, even traders who'd sell information for a bottle of whiskey. The map wasn't just a key to water, it was a key to control over half the county. Whoever owned it could outlast droughts, dictate prices, and force others to bend the knee. James listened, feeling the weight of every word. This was bigger than a stolen ranch. This was the kind of fight that didn't end clean. As the day wore on, the sisters' voices grew steadier, the telling of the past both painful and necessary. By the time the sun slid toward the ridgeline, James knew the truth. The Galloways would come, and when they did, it wouldn't be with a knock on the door. It would be with guns drawn. He checked his rifle again that evening, the habit of a man who'd been in trouble before. The women ate more than they had that morning, and Tara even managed a faint smile when James set a small tin of honey on the table. But under it all, the tension was a coiled wire. Somewhere out there, the Galloways still wanted what these sisters carried, and James had just put himself in their line of fire. Part 3. The first sign was dust on the horizon, a thin brown smudge against the late afternoon sky. James had been mending a section of the fence when he saw it. The slow, steady plume of riders who weren't in any hurry. Men who knew exactly where they were going. He set the hammer down and walked to the porch, wiping the sweat from his brow, his eyes fixed on the approaching shapes. Lyra stepped out of the doorway behind him, her gaze narrowing. "Cyrus," she said, her voice low and certain. James didn't need to ask who Cyrus was. The name was as heavy as a loaded gun in these parts. Silas Cyrus, Galloway's right hand, a man who'd built a reputation on the bodies of anyone foolish enough to cross him. The riders drew closer, the glint of sunlight on steel catching the air. Cyrus was in the lead, tall in the saddle, his black coat snapping in the wind, his hat shadowing a face carved from hard years. His eyes were pale, flat, and cold, and when he pulled up just short of the porch steps, the air seemed to tighten. "Afternoon," Cyrus said, his tone almost polite, which somehow made it worse. "I hear you bought yourself a fine little piece of land, James." James didn't move from his spot. "If that's what you call it." Cyrus' gaze flicked past him to the darkened interior of the house, where he knew the sisters were. "Word is you've got some guests. 3 of them belong to me." James's jaw tightened. "People don't belong to anyone." Cyrus's smile was thin. "That's a nice thought. Trouble is, those 3 carry something that belongs to my employer. Something valuable. You hand them over, and we all walk away without blood on the ground." Behind him, the 2 riders shifted in their saddles, rifles resting easy across their laps. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could step aside, let Cyrus take them, and be done with it. Or he could say what he was about to say and throw himself into the storm. "They're not going anywhere with you," James said. The smile faded from Cyrus's face like a shadow slipping from the sun. "That's so." His voice had lost the polite edge, gone flat and dangerous. "You think you can stand between me and Galloway's business?" "Looks like I already am," James answered. Cyrus's pale eyes studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to draw then and there. Instead, he leaned forward in the saddle. "I'll give you 1 day. By sunset tomorrow, you ride those girls into town and put them in my hands. Do that, and you might just keep breathing. Don't, and I'll come back with more men than you can count, and I'll burn this place down to the last nail." He turned his horse with a flick of the reins, his men following, the sound of their hoofs fading into the wind. Only when the dust had settled did James hear movement behind him. Lyra stood there, arms folded, her expression unreadable. "You could have let him take us," she said. "Would have saved you a world of trouble." James looked at her, then at Lena and Tara, who had appeared in the doorway. are not in the habit of handing people over to be killed, even if it means Cyrus brings half the county down on you," Lena asked quietly. Even then, the silence that followed was heavy, not with mistrust, but with the weight of a choice. They hadn't decided yet whether James was worth trusting with their lives. And now the clock was ticking. Lyra stepped forward. "You don't know what you're getting into. Cyrus is not like other men. He doesn't bluff. If he says he'll burn this place, he will. And he'll make us watch first." James met her gaze. "Then we'd better be ready for him." They spent the rest of the afternoon in intense preparation. James checked every firearm in the house, laid out extra ammunition, and showed the sisters the hidden spots in the barn and cellar in case things went bad. He could see the calculation in their eyes, the way they measured him not just as a man with a gun, but as someone who might hold their secret or betray it. As the light bled out of the sky, Tara sat by the stove, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "If we tell you where it is," she said softly, "you'll have to carry it, too. The danger, the weight of it, and there's no giving it back." James didn't hesitate. "Then I'll carry it." Lyra studied him for a long time before nodding just once. "We'll decide by morning," she said. "If you're still here." He didn't tell them he'd be here whether they told him or not. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the promise of another rider's return. Power for the next morning broke cold, the kind of brittle desert chill that cut through a man's coat before the sun had a chance to warm it. James was already outside spitting kindling when the distant thud of hooves reached him. For a moment, he thought Cyrus had come early, but as the riders came into view, he saw the star glinting on a vest. Sheriff Ethan wasn't a man James knew well, but his reputation carried the weight of someone who'd managed to keep the peace in a place where the law was often just a word. Ethan reined up at the porch, dust on his coat, his eyes scanning the property like he'd been expecting trouble. "James," he said in greeting, his voice steady. "Heard Cyrus paid you a visit." James nodded. "Yesterday. Said he'd be back by sunset today, with enough men to burn this place down." The sheriff's mouth tightened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "Galloway's been pushing harder these past months. Folks are scared to speak out, but have been collecting stories, and you've got more than talk now." He dismounted, motioning to the two deputies who'd ridden with him. One carried a leather satchel worn from the trail. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were papers, land deeds, sworn statements, and most damning, a brittle sheet that once lined the bottom of an old storage chest. It was a ledger, Galloway's own, listing payments to men who'd carried out the clearing on the women's ancestral land. Besides certain entries was a chilling note: "While disabled, no survivors." James felt a slow burn rise in his chest as Ethan laid the evidence out on the table inside the house. Lyra, Lena, and Tara stood close, eyes fixed on the ledger as if staring at a wound. "We found this on a man named Gus," Ethan explained. "Drunk himself stupid in Dry Creek and bragged about what he did. When I locked him up, he sobered quick and decided maybe telling me where he kept his keepsakes was the smarter choice. This ledger's been in his family trunk since the night they raided your village." Lyra's voice was taut. "And you believe this will matter? Galloway owns half the town. The judge plays cards in his parlor." Ethan's gaze was steady. "It'll matter if we get it in front of the right eyes. And if you three are willing to testify names, dates, what you saw, you speak, and this ledger backs you, we've got a chance to tear a hole in Galloway's shield." James looked at the sisters. Trust wasn't something they'd handed out freely, but this was the first time he'd seen a flicker of something like possibility in their faces. Lena asked the question hanging in the air, "And if we do this, how long before Cyrus comes for us?" "He'll come," Ethan admitted. "That's why I'm here now. I can't post a guard on your ranch without making it worse, but I can ride with you to Red Mesa tomorrow. We get you under a federal marshal's watch, the evidence in their hands, and it's out of Galloway's reach." James could feel the tension coil tighter. Leaving meant abandoning the ranch, but staying meant waiting for Cyrus' fire. Lyra's eyes found James's, weighing his silence. "You'd ride with us?" she asked. "If you go, I go," he said simply. Ethan's deputy stepped outside to give them a moment. The sheriff stayed, his presence filling the room without pushing. "I know what Cyrus told you," he said. "I also know men like him. They thrive on fear. But once the truth starts moving, even they can't stop it without exposing themselves. This ledger is more than proof it's a weapon." The sisters exchanged a look, silent but full of meaning. Finally, Lyra gave a small nod. "We'll testify," she said, "but not because we believe the law will save us, because our father's blood deserves more than silence." Ethan inclined his head, the gravity of her words not lost on him. "Then we move fast. Pack only what you need. I'll have fresh horses ready by dawn." Outside, the sun was climbing, casting long shadows across the yard. It seemed to James that the light made the place look different, as if the walls themselves understood the shift. This was no longer just a fight to keep 3 women safe. It was a fight to pull the truth into the open in a land where truth was a dangerous thing to carry. Part 5. By midday the next day, Ethan had ridden off to set the wheels in motion for the trip to Red Mesa, leaving James and the sisters alone again on the ranch. The plan was simple enough on paper: stay alive until dawn, ride out with the sheriff, and deliver the evidence and testimony to the marshal. But in the West, paper plans burned faster than dry brush. Cyrus had not yet returned, but the land itself seemed to hold its breath. James worked with a steady rhythm, moving through the yard to fortify what they could. He boarded up the weakest windows, set extra nails in the door frames, and made sure the barn doors could be barred from the inside. Lyra and Lena helped string wire between fence posts, creating choke points for anyone trying to rush the property on horseback. Tara carried buckets from the well, her small frame bent under the weight, but refusing to be sent inside. The air was tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. Yet something had shifted. The sisters no longer hovered apart from him, wild creatures waiting to bolt. They worked beside him without question, their glances carrying the quiet acknowledgement that whatever happened next, they were tied to each other's fates. Just before sunset, the first sign of trouble came. A single shot cracked in the distance, harmless, but meant to be heard. James dropped the hammer he'd been holding and moved toward the sound, scanning the tree line at the edge of the property. He caught the flash of movement, a rider turning his horse and vanishing into the scrub. A scout. That night, the sabotage began. A small fire started in the far corner of the barn, caught early only because Lena smelled the smoke while fetching tools. They doused it before the dry boards could flare, but the message was clear. They were being tested, pushed, and kept awake. The second night, someone cut the rope on the water trough, spilling the precious supply into the dirt. James found the track's boot prints leading back toward the wash. He didn't follow. Chasing shadows was a good way to get killed. Instead, he doubled the guard, setting watches through the night. He took the first, Lyra the second, Lena the last until dawn. It was during one of these quiet hours, sitting on the porch steps with the rifle across his knees, that Lyra broke the silence. "You could still walk away," she said, her voice calm but heavy. "Ethan will take us. You'd be free of this." James didn't look at her. "Walking away is something I've done enough of in my life. Too much." She was quiet for a long moment. Our people had a word for men who stand when they don't have to. It meant those who carry another's fire. He finally met her gaze, seeing no trace of the guarded suspicion she'd worn since the first day. "I'm not carrying it for you," he said. "I'm carrying it with you." The next morning, they found one of the horses dead in the pasture, its throat cut, left to bleed out in the dust. Tara wept openly, not just for the animal, but for what it meant. The enemy was close enough to touch them and confident enough to leave a sign. James buried the animal himself, the axe slow and deliberate, as if each shovelful of dirt was a vow. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, they sat together in the dim light of the main room. Lena mended a tear in Jamie's shirt, her hands deft and sure. Tara leaned against Lyra, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. There was no talk of tomorrow, only the unspoken understanding that it might not come. Yet in the quiet, In the smell of wood smoke and the steady rhythm of Lena's stitching, James felt something he hadn't expected: belonging. They were not bound by blood, but by choice, by the decision to stand in the same place against the same storm. As the night deepened, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Somewhere beyond the dark, vultures circled impatient arcs, waiting for the desert to claim what it always did. But inside, with rifles ready and the fire steady, they held their ground. Part 6. The sun was already high when the dust began to settle over the valley, not from the wind, but from the last retreat of Galloway's men. The fight had been short, fierce, and final. Cyrus lay somewhere out in the scrub, his shadow no longer a threat, and Galloway himself had been taken away under Ethan's watch. The ledger and testimonies sealing a fate the desert would not let him escape. For the first time in weeks, the air felt open, the land no longer holding its breath. James stood at the porch, his rifle still in hand, watching the empty horizon as if expecting one last trick, one last ride. But only silence came, the kind of silence that carried the promise of an ending. Behind him, the sisters moved through the house with the purposeful energy of people claiming what had been stolen. Lena opened windows that had been shuttered since the first threats, letting in light and wind. Lyra took stock of supplies, her voice calm but carrying that quiet authority she had never asked for but always held. Tara swept the floors, each stroke sending dust motes swirling in the shafts of sunlight. The ranch had survived, but barely. Fences were down, the barns still bore scorch marks, and half the pasture had gone to weeds during the weeks of siege. Yet when James walked the perimeter, his boots crunching in the dry soil, he saw more than ruin. He saw lines where new posts would stand, furrows where crops might take root, and the faint glimmer of water in the well that had once been threatened. That afternoon, they began. James mended the fence with Lena, the two working in companionable silence, the creak of wire and thud of posts marking the rhythm of their progress. Lyra and Tara turned the soil in the small plots behind the barn, their hands moving with the practiced familiarity of those who had coaxed life from stubborn earth before. The desert was cruel, but it was not without mercy to those willing to work for it. In the evenings, they sat on the porch as the sun bled red across the sky, its light painting the land in the color of memory and promise. Sometimes Ethan rode by, checking on them, bringing news from town, how Galloway's influence was crumbling, how those who had feared to speak were now stepping forward. He never stayed long, always tipping his hat to the sisters with a respect few men in the territory offered. One night, as the heat faded and the crickets began their chorus, Lyra spoke softly. "When our father was alive," he said, "the land remembers the hands that keep it, that if we were forced to leave, it would wait for us." She glanced at James, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Maybe it's waited for all of us." James didn't answer right away. He was looking out at the rows they had planted that morning, the fragile green barely breaking the soil. "Then we keep it," he said finally, "and we make it remember us for the right reasons." There was no declaration, no touch, but something passed between them in that moment. An understanding built from nights on watch, from shared danger and loss, from the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. By the time the first shoots grew strong enough to stand against the wind, the ranch was beginning to look less like a place under siege and more like a home. The scars remained: the burnt beam in the barn, the unmarked grave in the pasture, but they stood alongside the signs of rebuilding: a repaired roof, a straight fence line, and a garden that promised food in the months to come. And in the mornings, when the red sunlight spilled over the desert, it touched for figures moving across the yard together, bound not by the past alone, but by the life they had begun to build, quietly defying the cruelty of the land that had tried to break them.